Hello, my lovely viewers. I'm here to teach about the scripture. Yeah. So kindly you can grab a cup of coffee, maybe tea or something, and just give me like 15 minutes of your time as we go through it. I'm not going to preach, I'm actually teaching, giving you the basic of this scripture so that when you have time, you can go in and maybe read it at your own good time and pace. So thank you very much, and I'll start straight away. Now, we're going to talk about the book of Mark. But first, before we start, um, now a gospel is a different kind of literature. We're talking about the gospels literature. It's not a biography, not a history. It's a news building time. And really, the Bible is a big newspaper. Yeah, it's news that is amazing, and the Bible has changed the world, and we are very much aware of it. Now, let me go through the stages that the four Gospels develop. Yeah, and do you know why we have four Gospels? One reason is when a famous person has died, the the interest is in that person developing through three stages. Now, the first stage, almost immediately, somebody will write an account of what the person had done during his lifetime. And we'll find an obituary notes in the newspaper of what that dead person did. It will develop by a phase two of what that person did and said, and they collect his speeches, his letters. Then the interest moves to phase three. And here we write a different kind of biography. And in this biography, they write in depth about the man, what made him tick, what was he like, what was his character, how was his temperament, and what motivated him, and what was he like. Now, interesting enough, these four Gospels fit exactly into this pattern. The first Gospel to be written is Mark's Gospel. And Mark tells us in his Gospel what Jesus did. So in Mark's Gospel, Jesus is all the time in action and is always on the move. Matthew and Luke comes along much later on. John was the last of the lot. He was interested in the person of Jesus. What was he like? Yeah? John looked at Jesus from the inside, whereby to understand Jesus from the inside, while the other three looked at Jesus from the outside, what he said and what he did. There is four dimensions of Jesus, and they are from a different angle. So here we have four different insights into Jesus from the four Gospels. These four Gospels make a complete portrait, and therefore we say Matthew saw Jesus as the King of the Jews, and Mark saw Jesus as the Son of Man, Luke saw Jesus as the Savior of the world, and John saw Jesus as the Son of God. Complete picture of Jesus. Now, Jesus has 250 names and titles. No man he ever lived to have such many names and titles. Now, let's look at this gospel from a reader's angle. Yeah. The question here is, who were these gospels intended for? Two gospels were intended for or written for Christian believers to build them up in faith, to give them stronger foundation in their belief about Jesus. In other two gospels were written for, or rather people who had no knowledge of Jesus but wanted to know about Jesus. Now so here we see that Matthew and John was written for believers. But again, we find a slightly difference in these two, in that Matthew was written for new Christians, mainly people who have converted. This will give them the insight into the kingdom that they have entered with the 5 block of Matthew's teaching. Now, the 5 blocks are the first being the lifestyle of the kingdom, the second is the kingdom mission, the third is the grace of the kingdom, the fourth is community of the kingdom, the fifth are the discourses in the Matthew and are about future of the kingdom. Those are 5 amazing subjects for a new convert to study. John was written for a mature Christian, and we know this because he says so in his gospel. He says, they were written that you may go on believing that Jesus is the Son of God, and going on believing, you may go on having eternal life. So you see, this John's Gospel was written for mature Christians to keep them rooted, firmly established in their faith. Let's look at Mark in a more deep way. The author, like the other 4 Gospels, does not name himself. They drop and hint in somewhere as to whom wrote the book. They all seem to be saying they wanted all their attention to be on Jesus, not on them. Now, so here Mark does not tell us this is the Gospel of Mark. We know it was. Nevertheless, we'll draw the attention to the fact that he wrote the book. Now, we know he has 3 names. Mark is his Latin name, which is Marcus. It tells us, though he was a Jewish, he did have an official Roman connection. And we know his family had a big house in Jerusalem. His Hebrew name was Johanan. This means Yahweh has shown grace. His third name was Kolobodaktolos, which means stubby fingers. So he was born with stubby fingers. Now these same stubby fingers wrote the first gospel ever to be written. So here we have 3 names, nickname Greek, and Latin name, then a Hebrew name, all named for him. So when Jesus died, they used the 3 languages on the cross: Greek, Latin, Hebrew. It was Mark who records those writings above the cross. Matthew's mother was Hebrew. Her name was Miriam. We assume his father died, although we do assume again his father may have been the man who carried the pitcher on his head. This is the time when Jesus was making secret arrangements for the Last Supper. And there is a place where Jesus says, in Mark 14:13, Jesus tells 2 disciples to enter Jerusalem, where they will meet a man carrying a water jar. Jesus instructed them to follow him to the house. So here we get a hint that the upper room where supper was to be held was at Mark's house. And here we get a hint that it was Mark who wrote this gospel. Again, at the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus on the last night, before he died, was praying in agony. It's only in Mark's gospel that this is recorded, since we know the disciples were asleep. And in the garden, we know that Jesus was praying, and then the temple guards came, arrested Jesus. It says they grabbed hold of a young man who was wrapped in bed sheets. And the young man ran away, leaving the sheets in the hands of the soldier hands, and he ran naked. This man could only have been Mark. Mark must have followed them to Gethsemane in secret, wrapped in his sheets, and hid behind an old olive tree. So the entire drama unfolds. And here again, this is how we know what Jesus prayed. Jesus was not likely to have told anyone about that prayer. But Mark heard everything Jesus saying, Abba, Father, all things are possible. For you remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want. We see all this written in Mark's gospel. He's saying in that incident, I was there. I ran home naked, and the sheet was taken away from his body by a temple guard. As we continue, we know as a youth, Mark saw Jesus, and he was never a leading figure in the New Testament. There is not much mentioned of him, but he was always a number two, someone's personal assistant. And we also know that he was a personal assistant to other 4 Christian leaders in the early church. He had an older cousin called Barnabas, whereby he was his assistant then. He became an assistant before he became an assistant to Paul. But years later in Rome, Mark met Luke, and in fact, there is a direct connection between Mark's gospel and Luke's gospel. Then finally, Mark becomes personal assistant to Peter. For Peter had arrived in Rome after Paul and used Mark as his interpreter, for Mark was educated in Latin. Peter was just a Galilean fisherman and was not educated. He did not know Latin. So when Peter arrives in Rome, he had to speak through Mark. Now, these were the days of Nero, and the church members knew that Peter, being outspoken, he would be assassinated, and instructions would come from the Rome emperor. So church members asked Mark to record Peter's preaching to Latin languages, and this time they were in Rome. Peter was not at all keen to have his preachings recorded, but he neither hindered nor encouraged Mark to do this. Little did Peter know, or Mark know, that this gospel would be studied 2,000 years later, and be read all over the world. God had a plan for it. And thank you for this, because today we know the Gospels and is read to us. We are very thankful to that time it was recorded. This Gospel has been called the Gospel of Peter because you can hear Peter's preaching in it. Bear in mind, all the New Testament was spoken before it was written. And that's why it's so lively and grammar not too good, because it's a spoken record. Peter was the action man, the man who wanted to walk on the water, the one who jumped into the water when John said, "That's Jesus on the shores." And he was the one who tired to wait for Jesus to appear after the resurrection and said, "I am going fishing." Peter never sat still. You can see a complete, breathless excitement all the way through Mark's gospel, and you get one word that comes 40 times, and the word is immediately, straight away. He entered into the boat. Straight away, the boat was on the other side. It's as if it crossed the Sea of Galilee in 2 seconds. Now, and here we see everything in this gospel is immediately. And a person gets carried along on the excitement as they read through. Yeah, this gospel is the most vivid and alive amongst the other gospels, and that was Peter's style of preaching. Now here we find out that Peter was never interested in long sermons, as we find none recorded except one that must have left a deep impression on him. No sermons on the Mount, there is just actions. And this Gospel of Mark also concentrates on Peter's weaknesses, not his strength. And now it is in this book that we find, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, but not the saying of Jesus when he says, "You are Peter, I will build my church on this rock." So here we see Peter constantly sharing his weaknesses. These are the times he let the Lord down, but he never boasted. It's in the other gospel that you will find Peter's good points. Again, it's in this gospel that you find Peter's denial, not his reinstatement. Kindly please read John's gospel to find Peter's restoration. It's 3 times, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" Anyway, and this gives us the proof that this is Peter's gospel that Mark documents down. Then there is Peter's interest in Jesus' miracles. There are many miracles in Mark's gospel in comparison with the other gospels. For example, there is 18 miracles in Mark's gospel, whereas there's only 9 parables. Yet in Matthew, there are 24 parables. Luke again, 24 parables. So here we see Peter's interest was more on miracles, not in parables. He has more interest in what Jesus did more than what Jesus said. Now, again, we also come across Peter's ignorance as well as his knowledge, because Peter did not know where Jesus was born. He never said so in any of his speeches, nor does it appear in any of his other letters later on mentioned in the Gospels, in the letters. All of Peter's knowledge of Jesus began at the River Jordan, where Peter and Andrew were baptized, and Jesus was baptized there as well. And John introduces them to Jesus, and he ends everything with his resurrections. In Mark's gospel, there is no Christmas story. This is another proof that Mark's gospel comes from Peter. Mark's construction of his gospel is done amazingly, and his framework will later be used by Matthew and Luke, and they will use Mark's material in a much different way. Matthew splits Mark's gospel into bits and mixes them with his materials, whereas Luke took big blocks of Mark's materials and uses these chunks in his gospel. So we see that both Mark and Matthew expounds on Mark's materials. So let's go to the structure of Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel covers 3 years of Jesus' public ministry. Now, the story starts from River Jordan, which is the lowest point of the earth's surface. Then the story moves from Jordan River to Galilee, and going uphill to the highest point in the promised land, which is Mount Hermon, at its foot of which is the little city called Caesarea of Philippi. The whole story over 2 years has been building up to this crisis to reach this climax. When they reach this point, Jesus sets his face to go to Jerusalem. It's downhill all the way from this highest point down to Judea, where Jesus will die on the cross, where 3 days later he resurrects. Now, why is this important about the highest point? What was Jesus waiting for to reach this high point, which took 2.5 years to reach? Because after this point, we see things take a different course right down to Judea, where we know will take 6 months then to the cross. Now let's backtrack to the Galilee in Mark's gospel, where it covers 2.5 years from Judea up Mount Hermon. Here we see 3 phases of the ministry, and these 3 phases are the theme of Mark's gospel. Phase 1 is where Jesus is very popular. 1,000 come to him, he heals them. Chapter 1 to 3, Jesus' ministry is at its peak and is very successful. Now the second phase, where he's starting to meet opposition, and one of these differences is over the Sabbath. It builds up, and Jesus starts to make lots of enemies. The third phase is in chapter 7 to 9, and Jesus starts to concentrate on his 12 disciples. And from 1,000, he spends all his time with these men. So here, chapter 1 to 9, there he covers 2.5 years. Then we have chapter 10 covering 6 months. Chapter 11 to 16 covers its last weeks. Now we must ask ourselves, what happened there at the highest point, at the peak of Mount Hermon, that changes its directions of Jesus' ministry? That's a question to be asked now. There at the foot of Mount Hermon, there is a place called Caesarea Philippi. This place is the beginning of the River Jordan, and this river is about 30 to 40 feet wide. It comes straight out of a cliff of the foot of Mount Hermon. It's just water coming out of a rock. Now you must know Jordan is a river that starts nowhere and finishes nowhere. And the snow on the top of Mount Hermon melts down and comes down a rock inside the mountain and then comes out of the hole underneath the surface of the river. So it looks like a wide river coming out of a cliff. This in the old days was a strange sight. And then in those days, people believed in superstitions around this particular place with this super spectacular sight, like water gushing out of the rock out of nowhere. So such a place, especially this one, is a particular religion and a cult place, and will formulate around such a place. What I'm meaning, such a place, you'd find a lot of religion around it and cults, because it's very peculiar and it's very mysterious in those days, and it was happening. And pagan worship was practiced here for centuries. Now, above this water coming out of this cliff, there was a cave, and there in that cliff face, there are enclaves carved there, are there to this very present day. They are there if you went. Now, in those enclaves, they used to put statues of gods. And that time, there was two particular statues at that time. One statue of the Greek god Pan, and up till today, this place is called Panias. The other statue was a statue of Caesar, and this statue of Caesar had been put there by one of Herod's four sons called Philip, who had been given this part of the land when King Herod died, and he called the place after himself and called it Caesarea Philippi. So here we see that time there was two statues of Greek god Pan, who was supposed to have appeared as a mortal man on earth, and beside this was a statue of Caesar, who is a man who already had called himself God. So here we have two statues, as I'm explaining. Now Jesus takes his 12 disciples up to this point and asks them, who do men say he was? Putting in mind, behind them there were two statues, and Jesus knew they were aware of them, and he had to bring them here to compare and see what they thought he was. So I hope you're getting to the point that I'm getting to here. Here Jesus is challenging them to see if all this time they had understood who really he was. After all, he had taught and nurtured them all along. So Jesus asked, where does he fit amongst these gods? They answer that many think that he, Jesus, was a reincarnation, since he was in his 30s, but very clever. So they said he must have lived before as a great leader. And Jesus answered in an interesting manner, then tell me who was I in my previous life? And they said, some say Jeremiah, others John the Baptist. Then Jesus changed the question and directed it to them, who do you think I am? You see, John had never before asked, Jesus had never asked this question. He had waited for 2.5 years to ask this question. 2.5 years, building up his ministry. And it was Peter who answered the question. And Peter said, you have lived before, but not down here on earth. You lived up in heaven, didn't you? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now Peter was the first man to say this, and the first lady to recognize Jesus as Son of God was Martha. That would be a few weeks later. Then Jesus was able to say to Peter, now I can do two things. He mentions two things that he had never mentioned before. He said, now I can build my church. Now remember, until this point, he had never mentioned the word church. He had preached, healed, fed multitudes, stilled the storm, but never mentioned that he was going to build a church. Now Jesus could not have built his church earlier on because people had not recognized who he was. And they had wanted from him was just healing and other stuff. But now at this high point of Mount Hermon, the church begins. So on this rock, said Jesus, I will build my church. It's on Peter's name meant rock. Simon was his first name, and the meaning of this Simon name meant reed, shaken in the wind. So Jesus says, you are Simon, you are Simon, you are a reed. I'm going to make you a rock. So as soon as Peter said, I know who you are, then Jesus said, I can build my church and I can die on the cross. And this was the first time that Jesus ever mentions cross. There was never a hint till now. Now, funny that Peter had just called Jesus King, Christ. Seconds later, he tells Jesus he would not let him die on the cross. And this is when Jesus rebuked him. It was here at the watershed that Jesus proceeded to take Peter and James and John up the top of the mountain above the snow line, because it's always snowy at this mountain top. And it was here that Peter said that Jesus' cloth became brighter than any soap powder on earth. This was because the light was shining through Jesus' cloth from the inside, and Jesus' glory could be seen from henceforth. It was straight to the cross. Now let's look at what value Mark's gospel brings to us Christians. Number one, it shows who Christ was, and he was not an ordinary person, but Son of God. Now kindly let me speak some verses out in the book of Mark, and I will pick them randomly. Let me start. Yeah? He would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. Be quiet, Jesus said sternly. Jesus sent him away with a strong warning. See that you tell this to no one. Another verse, and he gave the strict order not to tell who he was. Another one, and he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this. Another verse, and he did not want anyone to know it. And Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone. Another is Jesus sent him home saying, don't go into the village. Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. And finally, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone. Now, if any of you have ever read the Gospels of Luke and Matthew or John, you find none of these verses. We see for the first 2.5 years, Jesus forbade anyone to discuss who he was. And after 2.5 years, he asks his disciples on the top of Mount Hermon the question of who he was. Do you see the way he has prepared them? He wanted his disciples to recognize him for themselves at their own time. He did not want them picking it up from evil spirits or from anybody else. Jesus wanted his disciples to get this knowledge from God, his Father. It's what is called the Mosaic secret. This happening at the foot of Mount Hermon is called the Great Confession. The second theme of Matthew's Gospel is the work of Christ. The most remarkable features of Mark's Gospel is his emphasis of the death of Christ. Mark's Gospel is like an express train slowing up. He gallops through the first 2.5 years in a few pages. Then he slows down. The next few pages covers months. Then slows down. The next few pages covers week. Then the next few pages covers a day. Then the next few pages covers hours. And then stops at the Golgotha and shows Jesus on the cross and tells us that's what he came to do. And as I wrap up, this gospel is emphasis on both human and divine aspect of Jesus Christ. The human aspect in Jesus was tried. He was tried for blasphemy, and blasphemy was a deserving of death in those years in Mosaic law, and it was for saying he was God. So they tried to get witnesses to agree as to what they had heard Jesus saying himself. The witnesses could not agree. So finally the judge did an illegal thing. He said to Jesus, I charge you, I adjure you by the living God to tell me who you are. And Jesus, being a Jewish, had to speak when adjured by the living God, the judge asked him, "Are you Christ, the Son of God?" And Jesus answered, "I am, I am." And the judge tore his clothes in a rage and said aloud, "You've heard it. What is your verdict?" And the 70 people said, "Death." The problem was they could not officially put someone to death because they were being occupied by the Romans, so they had to get Roman signatures for the death sentence. But in Rome law, blasphemy was not considered a crime. So as we come to the end, they had one thing to do, and that was to change the crime. And by the time they got Jesus before Pilate, the charge was treason and not blasphemy. Mark brings it out so clearly that the charge had changed from blasphemy to treason, and to say that Jesus called himself the King of the Jews. Jesus was never guilty of blasphemy. Jesus was never had nor of treason. From Mark's gospel, we get it that Jesus was sure he had come to die, to give up his life for ransom for many, and God planned it, and there was no avoiding it. In this gospel, there are two key words that run through, and they are fear and faith. It's the theme that Mark keeps bringing up again and again. Don't be of little faith, believe. Also, even after the resurrection, Mark brings it up. So the disciples did not believe when they saw Jesus. And Jesus had to rebuke them for their unbelief. And Jesus' favorite saying is, "Why are you afraid? Just believe. Don't be afraid." This gospel is best for a starter believer. It has basic knowledge of Christ. Thank you very much for listening to me. I know it's been a bit of a lengthy talk, but I'm happy to bring this kind of content on a weekly basis. If you like it, you can subscribe or give me a thumb up or like. Thank you very much, and we shall meet in our next session. Thank you.